there we go, now I think you can see my screen. The community wildlife is the program, is a part of Vermont Fish and Wildlife, where we go out to the communities and bring resources from the Agency of Natural Resources, and in particular Fish and Wildlife, directly to the community setting. So we work a lot with planning commissions or conservation commissions, or sometimes at the regional level as well, to try to see how the resources that we have at the state level can be used more locally. And that really brings us to BioFinder. Now, you may have used BioFinder in the past, but it's just been updated within the last few months, at the beginning of this year, or the end of last year. And so this webinar will really be going through what BioFinder is in general, but we'll also be including a lot of these changes to BioFinder. Whether you are a user of BioFinder in the past or if you're new, this should be appropriate to you. So welcome aboard. What is BioFinder anyway? BioFinder is really two things. It's a set of maps, but perhaps more importantly, it's a mapping tool. In many ways, you can think of this as a substitute for something like ArcGIS that's publicly available and online. It's certainly not anywhere near as advanced, excuse me, or complex, but it is free and available to the public. Excuse me, I have a little frog in my throat here. I'm just going to take a sip of water. All right, let's see if that got rid of it. Now, why BioFinder? BioFinder really fits into the agency's mission, and especially Vermont Fish and Wildlife's mission, to conserve Vermont's natural heritage. It's our way of sharing biodiversity information through maps. And there's a little bit of something there for everybody. Many users will use it to find information about where particularly conservation resources are. And I'll go into more detail about what I mean by conservation resources in a minute. But many users will use it to find information. There's also a tool in BioFinder for assessing priorities. Many people who work with conservation planning have tried in the past to look at various parts of their landscape and try to decide, well, where should we focus our efforts when we're working on conservation? Is that wetland over there more important, or should we focus on this place where wildlife cross the roads? And so this gives a very preliminary view of ways to assess priorities across the landscape. And because it has many tools associated with it, some users will also use it to create maps. You can use some tools to plan and collaborate and share projects with other people and create your own shape files, which are mapping files that I'll get to later. So today we'll get into a little bit of each of these. But one webinar can't do it all. And so there are things that I'll just mention I won't be going into in the next hour. And one of those things is this today is really going to be about how to use the BioFinder website and what you will find there. But I won't be going into detail about how we got to the data or the science behind it. Now the figure that you see on the screen, that image is an image of climate change. And I'll just mention briefly, I'm not going to go into climate change here, but I'll mention briefly that a changing landscape and a changing climate are the drivers for some of the information that we'll find here. The other things that we are not going to cover today are the next steps. I'm not going to cover what to do with the information you can find on BioFinder. But I will mention now and at the end of the webinar that there are many places you can go for that information. We at Vermont Fish and Wildlife often work with communities directly in interpreting the information that you find on BioFinder and on figuring out what those next steps are, what you can actually do with that information. So we won't be covering it today, but there are certainly means to get there. I should mention too that the first part of this workshop I'm going to go through a PowerPoint. The second part will go directly to the website and do some exploring. So don't worry, we'll get there. So why BioFinder? The premise behind the website itself is that the landscape is changing. Essentially, our forests are changing patterns. They're being divided apart a little bit more by fragmentation. We have different patterns of development. We have different patterns of land use than in the past. And these aren't bad or good, they're just different. We have a changing landscape. And in the midst of all these changes, we at the Agency of Natural Resources have a lot of information about important natural features. And so this website is a way of saying, well, who can use this information about natural features? It might be for planners, town level or regional level planners who would incorporate some of this information on ecological resources into their planning. It was also partly developed, the website was partly developed with developers in mind as well. There's been a lot of feedback from the development community that it would be nice to know where some of these natural resources are before they get to their regulatory process. And while BioFinder certainly doesn't have any level of regulatory information, the resources that are included here are certainly they're the ones that are likely to come up in the discussion about where to place development. Educators and scientists can certainly also use this information. And so the Agency of Natural Resources, as well as numerous partner agencies and organizations that are listed here, got together and created what we consider to be an online portal of information about biodiversity, where biodiversity is most prominent on the landscape. And the goal was really to make it accessible to everyone. It's just a website. And this new one, which is different from the old version of BioFinder, but this new one doesn't even require any downloads or anything. It's just a website that you can access from really any browser or even a smartphone or something like that. Now, I keep mentioning that we have biodiversity information that's included on BioFinder. What kind of information are we considering to be contributions to biodiversity? I'm going to list just a subset now, but we're talking about things like, where are the forests? Where are the biggest blocks of forest? And how do they connect across the landscape? How about the waterways? Where are the waterways? And where do those waterways have intact riparian areas? That means vegetation on either side of the stream. Where are there places where wildlife can travel up and down those streams, both within the water and in that vegetated area next to the streams? We look at where the wetlands are. We look at where really specific natural features are, like rare species or interesting communities, like this vernal pool, where this time of year there are these kind of isolated pools in the middle of the woods. We call them vernal pools, where amphibians and other animals go to breed, and it's a really important part of an ecosystem and certainly a contribution to biodiversity. So some really specific resources like that. Places where wildlife are most likely to cross roads. This is the type of information that you would use BioFinder to find. But in addition to just listing these contributions to biodiversity, BioFinder also, as I mentioned earlier, takes a look at where the most important ecological locations are on the landscape. So instead of needing to decide, as I mentioned earlier, between focusing your efforts on that wetland or that patch of that large patch of forest, we're really looking here at assigning priorities. What are the most important locations across the landscape? And I'll get more into this in just a minute. Now, if you have used BioFinder in the past, our look at prioritizing the landscape has changed gears. And now, if you haven't used BioFinder in the past, this is still for you, because really this shift in our focus in our means of prioritizing reflects a shift in how we do conservation. In the past, BioFinder, and often in conservation in general, we would look for what we would call a co-occurrence. This is where we would put data sets, different information layers like wetlands and large blocks of forest and rare species all on top of each other, and we would look for places where they overlap. And where the most overlap occurred, we would map it like this, where the areas of the highest amount of overlap are in the darker purple and blue, and the places with the least amount of overlap are in the green and yellow. And so we would really point to these hotspots of biodiversity where a lot of different things are happening all at once. The new model, which we call Vermont Conservation Design, takes a new approach. And instead, we're really looking at the function, the overall function and pattern of the landscape. And so we're selecting from the same data sets, it's the same information sources, but instead of laying them on top of each other, we look at how they connect and we look at the patterns that they create across the landscape. So instead of having the many different layers of priority as in the old maps, we have just the darkest green, which is the highest priority, the lighter green, which is still important ecologically, but not as high a priority, and then that white background, where those aren't places to really focus conservation efforts, according to this model. I do want to kind of place a finer point on what I mean by that as well. So in the past, if you were looking at these features on the landscape, we have up here, the circle is a location where a rare species was found. And that's along this habitat. This is the habitat of the rare species. That might be where it's kind of an uncommon community of plants and animals. And then that's located at the edge of a wetland, which is within a large block. We call it interior forest block. That means it's a really big block of forest that doesn't have any roads or buildings in it. And this is in the context of a greater landscape with buildings and roads and other patches of maybe smaller forest. And in the past, I'll just share that where we focus our conservation efforts, where we would say, you know, right there, that is where there's a lot going on. The location of a rare species overlaps with that uncommon habitat type, which overlaps with the wetland, and it's part of a large interior forest block. And so we would focus our highest priority right there, followed by this, and followed by the rest of it. But when we look at that now, we realize, well, that rare species is probably there, and maybe even that natural community, that uncommon location where it was found, that's probably there, not just because that happens to overlap, but because it's part of a bigger wetland. And if you want to protect the wetlands, then you really need to protect the watershed, which is part of that larger interior forest block. They're all connected together. And if we're looking at this in the face of a changing climate in particular, where things might be expanding and contracting their ranges, then we've realized we really have to focus not just on that one hotspot, but we really need to start our efforts by looking at the overall pattern. And the overall pattern says that this all functions as a whole, this entire area. Now, in terms of what to do about it, it might at first seem like covering that entire area, well, that's everything. Isn't that obvious? But we want to make sure that in our conservation efforts, we're keeping that pattern in mind, and that's the first thing that we do. And then on top of that, we can look at those important natural features. We can still, at that point, look at, well, that habitat is pretty special on the landscape. There is something going on there that we might want to pay attention to. There's also the location where that rare species was recorded. That's proof we have that there was a rare species there. There's something special about that spot too. Let's also look at this place where wildlife are going to be crossing back and forth across the road, because if we want them to continue moving across the landscape, we need to make sure that that crossing continues. So what we're really doing in this new version of BioFinder is dividing all of these important features of biodiversity into two scales. So on the one hand, we're looking at things like connectivity blocks. That's how all of our forests and natural lands connect across the whole state. And the important part at this scale is to maintain that pattern. We really want to maintain those connections across the state, but this is a large area of land. That's nearly half of the state in that one data layer. And these aren't particularly sensitive places, but they are places where we want to look at that pattern. And then on the other hand, we have something like a rare natural community. These are very small. They take up a very small land area in Vermont. But when we go to thinking about what to do about them, these are also resources that are much more sensitive. If there's a single, some of these take up only an acre of land, and so a single activity on that landscape could significantly impact the resource itself. So for this new BioFinder, the first thing we've done is separate everything into these two scales. So at the landscape scale, we're looking at things like interior forest blocks. These are the biggest patches of forest. Landscape connectivity, the way undeveloped land connects to each other, so species can move across the landscape. Surface waters, that just means lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, and the riparian areas, the vegetation next to them, looking again at the patterns and those connections that they make. Riparian wildlife connectivity, places where wildlife can go up and down streams because there's that intact vegetation. And physical landscape diversity is something else we consider at this landscape scale, just looking at pattern. Physical landscape diversity refers to different combinations of bedrock and soil and aspect, whether it's facing north or south, how steep the slope is. Because different species live in different combinations of this physical landscape, it turns out that places, one way to protect biodiversity, since we can't really inventory all species on the landscape, one way to focus conservation efforts so that we're protecting biodiversity as a whole is to look at where the physical landscape has diversity. If we protect the physical landscape diversity, we'll protect a diversity of species that live on it. So these are all, you can imagine looking at these features from an airplane looking down on the landscape. They're very general. Altogether, they make this map of the state, which is 68% of the state. This is a lot of land area. But like I said, the important thing that we're going to do, the important message with these landscape scale features is to really focus on the pattern. If we can maintain that pattern, then things can move around and still have the space they need. We want to manage them to maintain function, but these are the same places in Vermont that make up our working landscapes. These are our working forests. These are the places we go for recreation. And most of these activities are going to be entirely compatible at this landscape scale. So just starting out by looking at that pattern. And then we can zoom in and look at the species and community scale. This is more the scale that you would see on a hike through your woods. This is where we can look at rare and uncommon species, significant natural communities, those groups of plants and animals that tend to live together when environmental conditions align. This is where we can look at vernal pools and wetlands, mass stands, which are groups of trees that are heavy in beech and oak, and those nut-rich species that many wildlife go to for food sources. Grasslands and shrublands, places where wildlife tend to cross roads. Representative lakes are 100 lakes that have been chosen within the state that represent the different types of lakes within the state, and they're the samples that are in the best qualities or conditions of each of the lake types that we have in the state. Exemplary surface waters are waters known to be rich in biodiversity. They tend to be good trout streams, for example. So everything on this list, these are things that are much more sensitive, and so we would want to look at them in a different way than those grand landscape features. These might be places to really consider a higher level of protection when we get to what to do with the features mapped. So in BioFinder, and we'll go there in a second, but in BioFinder, we have at each scale ranked an overall priority rank. So at the landscape scale, which we call Vermont Conservation Design, the darker green is the highest priority. The lighter green is still important, but not as high a priority. And then at the species and community scale, we have the same thing, the highest priority and priority, different landscapes or different locations. In BioFinder, you can look just at those priority layers, or you can separate them apart and see each of those components individually. One last thing before we go to the website itself is when you're looking at the data that's provided in BioFinder, I'd just like to remind everybody that this is a resource created at the state level. And so this is what you'll see there is state data and state priorities. By state data, what I mean is for something like rare species, we've never done an inventory of all rare species at the state. And so what we expect to find there is really just this is what the Agency of Natural Resources has collected as a state. But in a community, at a community level, you might know about a lot more resources that are not in our state's database. Rare species is one example. Many of those species and community scale components are going to be similar. Grasslands, for example, are fairly well represented on our data set in the Champlain Valley. And our data is quite lacking in other parts of the state. So you can use this as a preliminary look at things to look at the local level, but there certainly may be things lacking. The priorities as well, any of those priority data sets are looking at priorities at the state level. So when we're looking at connectivity blocks, for example, this is looking at the way forests and undeveloped landscapes connect across the state. And our map is really looking all the way from the Berkshires up the spine of the Green Mountains and looking at connections into Canada, and going over from the Adirondacks into the Green Mountains and up into the Northeast Kingdom and beyond. We're taking these priorities at a state scale. However, if you are located in the Champlain Valley, our maps are not going to have very much there. It's a much more fragmented area. However, at a local level, these connections are still going to be very important to you as a community. If you want to maintain the wildlife that you have, one of the best ways of doing it is to maintain the connections that you have. But our state priorities may not tell you how to do that at a local level. They may not constitute priorities for the state, even though they are priorities at the local level. So with that, I'm going to suggest that we go to the website itself. I'll leave this on the screen for just a minute. And you can either copy it down. If you'd like to go to the website with me and follow along, you can certainly do that. Or you can just watch what I'm doing and practice on your own later on. Now, when you go to the website itself, this is what you'll see. This is our home page. And I'll pause here just for a moment to point out that there are a few places you can come back to later if you want more instruction on what to do. So tips and tools, for example, if you go in that menu, we'll have some, I almost want to call them instructions, but the tips is probably a good word for it. But it'll show you what to do and what some of the tools do. I'll go a little briefly into how to create a report while we're in there, but you can find more information, how to interpret your results. This tab also has some video tutorials, excuse me. At the moment, the only one there is this introduction to BioFinder, but we have plans to make some video tutorials of some of the most common tools and strategies that people use when they're going to BioFinder. But the most important part is this icon right here where it says see the map. And you can click there and it will open up the map in a new tab. I'm not going to wait for it because I already have it in another tab, but it looks like this, and you'll see the state of Vermont kind of highlighted in green when you go there. Now, when you first open BioFinder, there's one thing checked on, and it's this Vermont Conservation Design Landscape Scale. And I'll use this to show this just in general how this works. Now, if you're used to using even something like Google Earth or any other mapping software, then this follows a pretty similar pattern to most mapping products. But you can drag and move things around. You can zoom in either by clicking the plus or the minus, or I have a mouse with me so I can use the scroll bar to zoom in and out. You can, on the left, under the word layers, this is where it has all of the different data sets that you can turn off or on. So at the moment, what's checked is Vermont Conservation Design Landscape Scale. Those are those landscape scale priorities where we're looking to maintain patterns and maintain the overall function. Underneath that, it says species and community scale. Again, up at the top, these two, as I'm turning them off or on, these are just looking at those priorities of all of the data sets compiled into one group. Now, if I click those off, I can also go down here, and you'll notice that it says component layers. Anytime you see a plus sign in this layers menu, it means you can click it and you'll get more information. That I clicked it and that list appeared. And then a minus sign, you can collapse it again. Click this and that list appears, or the minus and it collapses. And you can get the individual components. So up at the top, you get the overall priorities. Down at the bottom, you get the individual components. And to get things to turn on, everything is nested. So to get the components, you need to make sure this is checked on. This one is checked on. And then you can check the ones that you'd like. Riparian wildlife connectivity, for example. Now, I'll give you a little warning here that you'll notice it took just a moment to appear. That wasn't amazingly slow, but I will say that the BioFinder server, the more people who are using it at once, the slower we get information. Most of the time when you're using this at home across the state, there's only a handful of people who tend to use it at the same time. And so it'll usually go pretty fast. Right now, while we're doing this, this tutorial, and we might have 30 people using it at once, it may go slower just because we are all here at the same time. So if it starts to go extremely slow, I might ask people to back off a bit, but we'll go with it until then. So you can turn on individual layers down here as well. A couple just general thoughts to keep in mind. Just like in many mapping programs, a layer appearing down below goes on the bottom. So if I turn on highest priority connectivity blocks, you can see that brown layer appear in the back. And on top of that is the riparian wildlife connectivity. I mention this because sometimes you might turn something on and say I had already had this block on, for example, the highest priority interior forest block. And then I wanted to see the connectivity. Sometimes you can turn it on and you don't see much difference, and that's because a lot of that same area is taken up by the green. You have to turn off that block on top in order to get it to show. The other thing, well, let's see, yep. So if you want to see the data on the bottom, you sometimes have to turn off the data on the top. The other time that really comes into play is that down here you have the components, the individual components. Up at the top, once you turn on these prioritized components, they appear on top of the component layers. In this case, there's another way to see the data underneath. If you can look at where my cursor is, this is a bar that makes it more transparent or more opaque. And so you can play around with that. So turning data layers on and off by those little check marks is maybe the first tool to learn in BioFinder. Now, in addition to that, though, there's a really easy way of getting information in BioFinder. Now, given that even when you first open it and it looks like this, now the only layer I have turned on right now is the Vermont Conservation Design Landscape Scale. And, you know, I live in the town of Middlebury, so I'm going to zoom in on Middlebury. Now, if I want to find information really quickly about the town of Middlebury, it's actually really easy. All I need to do is click. And with that one click, a box pops up. And it tells me, of the layers that are turned on over here that I have checked on, it tells me what's here. And if that layer that's checked on is this overall priority layer, the Vermont Conservation Design, then it lists all of the possibilities, all of the data sets that went into making that conservation design, and it puts a check mark next to everything that's present in that location. So I found that location. If I want to find a different location, I can click here, and another box pops up. And in this place, it has a priority, so not highest priority, but priority interior forest block, and it has a responsibility physical landscape, one of those one of those more interesting pieces of the physical landscape, the geology and climate contributions. Now, I'll do this again, but this time I'm going to have two different layers turned on over here. I have Vermont Conservation Design, the landscape scale, and I have the species and community scale. So those patterns and those individual places. And this time, if I point my cursor in the same place, but where there's a purple and a green, then watch what happens. I click it, and the first thing that pops up, it says species and community scale. There's a rare species that was found there. But you'll notice that up here in the top right corner of my box, it says 1 of 2. There are 2 pages of results there, so I can click to the second page, and this gives me the conservation design report. And again, there's that interior forest block and the physical landscape. And so I can go back and forth and learn many layers that are present in that same location. So this can be a really quick way of learning more about a landscape. Now, say I want more information about these component layers. I can open up, let's see, in species and community scale, I want to know more about the wetlands. And I'm also interested at the landscape scale. Let's see, I want to know about the highest priority interior forest blocks. I can do the same thing with just clicking that mouse. If I want to know more about this interior forest block, I can click. It always starts out saying no results, so give it a moment if it starts out by saying that. And it'll highlight the block, the highest priority interior forest block that this is part of. And what that block is, that's a block that's entirely forest with no major roads or buildings. It's completely, excuse me, it's the natural land and it's surrounded by roads and buildings. And so in this case, it'll give me a little bit of just a quick overview of what highest priority interior forest block it is. But it gives you additional information too. It tells you that it's a statewide priority on a scale from 1 to 10, it's a number 9. So in terms of assessing priority, this is considered pretty high priority, this forest block. And it also gives you the the acreage of that block. Now, there are also 2 links here that allow you to link to additional information. If you do this top one, link to component abstract, the component abstract, this is the component highest priority interior forest blocks. This gives you information about that entire component, about all of the ways about all of the interior forest blocks in the state. And this report will pop up that tells you more about what interior forests are, what their ecological importance are, guidelines for maintaining ecological function, the conservation goal, and it tells you a little bit more about how that component was mapped as well. So you can learn more information about all interior forest blocks by clicking there. You can also get additional information about that forest block where I clicked right here, view additional details. And you'll notice that this layers menu turns into a list of information. Now, as you look through this list, some of these categories are going to mean more to you than others. Like it tells you an ID number. The ID number is pretty meaningless to most users, but it'll tell you anyway. If you're a GIS user, then I'll share that this box that pops up is the attribute table. So this is all of the attributes that are included with this data layer. But some of the information on here is going to be quite interesting to a number of people. For example, the percentage of permanently conserved land within that block, 60%. That could be useful information. As you scroll down, it gives you the building density and the average parcel size. There's some interesting information hidden in that list, as well as some things that might seem like they're in code. All right, so going back out here, I'm going to show you that there's actually additional information, additional data than what's included on this first list. And you can get there by going up to this box at the top of the screen. And you'll notice that right here it says prioritization right now under the layers menu. But if you click that, you can go to where it says inventory. And inventory gives a whole different set of layers. There's a separate set of layers. Now the difference between these two tabs is essentially this. Prioritization is, this is where BioFinder is really a special resource that sets it apart from other places. This is really the state's, the Agency of Natural Resources way of assigning priorities across the state. And so even a lot of these component layers, if you look down here, some of these are listed by priority level. However, the inventory theme gives you just straight raw information. This is not prioritized, or at least most data sets in here are not prioritized in any way. This is still just information that people use in conservation planning, but it's much more broad. So it's listed by 6 different maps, and each map has a different topic. These 6 maps are ordered so that if you start at the top, this is very general information, and then it kind of zooms in closer and closer until in map 6, we have things like amphibian and reptile crossings, deer wintering areas. I'll turn it on so we can see some of these. There's a lot of information in this map, so it tends to look a little bit crazy until you turn a couple things off. But deer wintering areas, wildlife linkage ratings, these are road crossings, but on a scale of 1 to 5 instead of just highlighting the most important ones. Mass stands, habitat blocks by state priority. So this is one that's kind of prioritized as a backdrop. But there's also, there's a lot of information on these maps. There's also up here in number 3, for example, forest pattern. This will give you habitat blocks by acreage. This is basically any block of undeveloped land that doesn't have roads or structures in it. And it's anything that's at least 20 acres. And so you can just see the acreage of these blocks. So there's lots of information here that you can explore later on. I will also share that if you have worked with the Community Wildlife Program before, or really Fish and Wildlife in general, these 6 maps are the same as the 6 maps that we hand out to towns. So many towns are familiar with these 6 maps already, or even have them hanging in their town offices. So I will, I'll leave this one for you to explore as I go back to the prioritization theme, but just know it's there. And before we finish, I'll take some questions in a few minutes. But first, I just want to at least open the toolbox and show you that there are some tools here. There are 2 ways to get to the toolbar. For one thing, there's a quick tools menu right here where we can there are just a few tools here where you can do something like zoom to a town, or zoom to a town, find an address, create a printable map. So you can print what you see on the screen. You can open and close a toolbar with many more tools. You can bookmark your current map extent to come back to later. I'll just show a couple of these now. I use the zoom to town tool all the time, where if you open that and just start typing in the name of the town, wherever your map is positioned, it will go to that town. I was already in Middlebury, so maybe that wasn't a great example, but and it'll take you to your location of interest. The other thing you can do is open this toolbar. This is the other way to open it, is to click on this this screwdriver and wrench up in the corner. And you can explore these various tools. There's map tools where you can do things like share or export your map. Now share, I'll show you this one. It looks at first like it's going to be share on social media. But this email tool is actually, I find, the best way to save your work. It will allow you to send an email to yourself or to somebody else if you want to share your work. And you'll notice that the body of that email is just a link. And that link will link you back to, that link will link you back to the map that you have visible on the screen with the same data layers highlighted. So if you want to either share that with somebody else, or if you want to kind of save your work and come back to it later, this share tool is the best way to do that. Export creates just a picture, an image file of the map that you have. And print creates, let's do a really quick version of this. It creates an image that has, it looks a little bit more fancy. And I'll show you what I mean by that, where it has the map that appeared on the screen, including a legend and a scale bar and things like that. I just took the defaults, but you can play around with it and make it a little bit more to suit your needs as well. Some other tools that are especially handy, there's some navigation tools. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to quickly pass over those for now. And go to, I'm going to go right over to, well, I'll go to map data. This is where you can do something like upload data. If you have a file, a shape file, or a KML, or basically any of the common mapping file types, you can upload that directly into BioFinder. And so you can upload, say, the property boundaries, or you can connect a GPS and connect your GPS points and upload those into BioFinder. If you want to use these priority scales, you can also download those to use in another GIS mapping program, or download the shapefile. So anything that uses a shapefile. Very quickly, I'll also just show the drawing tool. This is where if you want to create maps, you can use BioFinder to create your own shapefiles, which is a mapping file. So you can do something like, so I mentioned the town of Middlebury is my home. I could create a map of my town, and I'm just going to do this really quickly now. You can see I'm not taking a lot of time to get all the points right, but oops, and you'll always want to, you'll see my mistake here. I'll show you my common mistake by not zooming out enough, and I'll show you that now to show that you need to make sure you can see the whole image that you want to that you want, because it's hard to move it in the middle. But you can. But my point here is that you can create a drawing, and you can create several drawings. You can, highlight a town. You can make a circle. You can add some text. So I can write Middlebury. You can make drawings and mark them up. And now if I like what I'm drawing, I can, I can move around the map and it'll still be there. But if I want to save that drawing for later, not the whole map, but just that drawing, I can also export that drawing. And exporting it will download a shapefile onto my computer. I'm just going to save it onto my desktop. And I'll call it Middlebury. And then it'll be there on my desktop as a shapefile. So you could use that file in another mapping program if you want, or once you turn off your drawing tools, I can now clear this drawing from here. I clicked the clear and I told it to clear it, so there's nothing else left on here. Or I can use that drawing to upload back into my mapping program. What did I do? You have to select a file, of course. I'm just going to take that whole folder that I just made, upload it. I know I'm doing this fairly quickly, but I just want to demonstrate the process here for folks to come back to later on. And I can create a picture. Let's see. Oh, and it gave me that same file. Well, I should have used a different color that could be more visible, but I created my own file that I can click on and off and use with other information. Let's see. I think I will showcase just really quickly one more tool. You can explore these other tools later on, but I'll showcase one more tool that you can use here as well, and then I'll go to questions. But under the query menu, there's an identify tool, there's measurement over here, but under query, there's something called the landscape report or the species and community scale report. These reports will report back to you on on these layers, these prioritized layers that are here. There's either the conservation design, the landscape scale, or the species scale report. And the value of this, if you remember back to when I just clicked on it and you have this box pop up with information, this information box is extremely helpful, but it only relates to the very point, the pixel on which I pointed. That whole box tells you what's in that one pixel. If you want a larger area and you want to know kind of the same information, all of those landscape scale or community scale layers, you can run a report. And this report will allow you to either upload a shapefile. I could upload the file that I just drew, or I can do a user-defined area, click next, and draw an area of interest. Maybe I'll zoom in a little bit. Maybe this is the area down here. This is a really great one to do even at a property scale. Although of course you're getting priorities at the state level if you do that. But I'm just going to draw a box here around an area of interest. I'm kind of arbitrarily assigning this area of interest right now, but if you have a place that's special to you, you can do that. I'll submit that geometry, and this is the place that I'm going to get a report. You can either do an Excel table, so that'll give you a sheet of numbers, or you can do a PDF report. And this tool it takes just a minute to process. But this tool will give me back a report of all of the landscape scale layers that are in that geometry. I'll download that. And here's what it looks like. It'll give me a picture of that area that I drew. And then it tells you what the priority is, what the component is. So priority surface waters and riparian areas, there's 59 acres in that area. You can look for the places with the most acreage, which doesn't necessarily mean it's the most important. But this is a tool for giving you a really good profile of what you have to work with in an area of interest. Now keep in mind that many of these different layers overlap. So if you add up the acreage, you will not get the acreage of that entire polygon because there are many layers overlapping. But again, this gives you just a good profile of what to look for in a certain area. All right, now as you can see, there are many more tools here, and I don't have any time to go into these. But before I take questions, I am just going to go back and say there are ways to get more information. There's a guide called Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage that we are currently in the process of, it's in our public review stage right now. But this is really going to give a lot more information about all of the components mapped, as well as information about how to move forward with some planning tools. So look for that in the future. If you're not familiar with it already, there's also Conserving Vermont's Natural Heritage, which is a guide put together by Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department that again goes into a lot of the background information about ecological components that are used in conservation planning. So that's worth looking into right now. And Community Strategies for Vermont's Forests and Wildlife was put out by the Vermont Natural Resources Council. And I think of this as a toolbox for how a community can conserve or protect forests and wildlife. And it goes into regulatory and many non-regulatory strategies as well. So that's a nice toolbox to know about. There are also some upcoming workshops on BioFinder. The ones on the screen are the ones that we have scheduled right now. These are longer workshops and they'll be really hands-on. So feel free to contact me about any of these and signing up for these if they're close to you. I have my contact information here. Please feel free to contact me if you think if learning more about BioFinder for particular uses in your area would be useful, especially if you work with a group that does conservation planning. My colleague Jens Hilke or I would be happy to come to different organizations or different towns or different regions to work with people more on how to use BioFinder for particular purposes. So please feel free to contact me as well. All right, and now is the chance. I've yacked for quite a long time, but I would love to open this up for questions. If anybody would like to ask some questions. I'll say too, thank you for hanging in there with me for the last hour. I'd love to hear back from you if you find that BioFinder, if you think that BioFinder would be useful for you, or if you're finding that BioFinder is a tool that you use. Oh, and as I'm waiting for questions, I'll also mention, I almost forgot to say that there's actually a handout that you may have seen up there. That handout goes through some tips and some tools of how to use BioFinder. Goes through some of the tools that we went into today. More detail on some, not as much detail on others, but it might be a good place to start if you get back to your home or workplace and want more information.
And I'll just throw in that something I forgot to point out when I pointed out some of the features in the GoToWebinar panel. The handout that Monica is referring to should be listed in your panel. There's a handout section, and you can go ahead and download that right now.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah.
And also, there was one question about your PowerPoint, whether your PowerPoint will be available, and I answered that question. I said yes. I'm assuming it's going to be okay for you to send a copy of your PowerPoint so I can post it on our page.
Yeah, I can certainly do that. Yep. I'm sorry, and Leslie, I'm having trouble seeing the questions from my end, so if you see questions, please feel free.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any more right now, but.
Okay. I don't know why you're not seeing them. Okay, we do have a couple. What period of time was needed to develop the data that's behind BioFinder, asks Catherine.
Oh, that is a good question. So what period of time? It really depends on which data layer you are indicating. So, there are many individual data sets that went into this, and the answer is going to vary widely for each of those data sets. But the priority ones, the ones that we call the Vermont Conservation Design, that two-tone green map that first appears when you open it, has been in the works for the last few years. You know, I don't know actually exactly when they started it, but it's been on the order of a few years when the biologists at the Agency of Natural Resources, and it's a team of numerous different people from different backgrounds, really carefully looked at those priorities that were put into that, and carefully evaluated the places across the landscape that they thought were highest priority, and maybe didn't really constitute priorities at all. And it's been a very careful process over perhaps on the order of 5 years or so. And I'll also mention that what you see as the purple layer, the species and priority scale priorities, they're actually in the process right now, over the last couple years, of doing the same thing for that data layer. So right now what you see in the blue and purple, we have entire components like mass stands are all listed as priority and wetlands are all listed as highest priority. But right now they're in the process of going through and taking the time to figure out, are all mass stands just priority, or are some more important than others? And so you'll see over the next year or two that the data that's shown in BioFinder may change, as some mass stands, for example, might be determined to constitute higher priorities, and possibly some things that are at the highest priority right now are considered maybe not quite as high a priority.
Catherine also asks how many organizations were responsible for its development. You might want to go back to one of your early slides that showed that there were quite a few, although certainly most of the heavy lifting was done by various scientists.
Right. Let me hold on just a minute. Let me go through this way. So here's the list. And yes, so this is the list of organizations. And then, of course, the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources itself has various departments and numerous scientists involved. I would say the ones who probably Well, it depends on the data set. Different partners came in different ways. Like Vermont Center for Eco Studies weighed in heavily on the Vernal Pools data. Vermont, or the Nature Conservancy has been working a lot with connectivity, so those connecting land data layers. And so, yeah, so depending on the data set, different partners played a higher or lesser role.
And then Mahmoud also asks sort of an interesting big picture question, which is, would you say web mapping is the underlying engine behind BioFinder after long years of data generation?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that. Could you repeat the question?
Yep. Would you say web mapping is the underlying engine behind BioFinder after long years of data generation?
Is it the, I would say, I think what's happening is web mapping is becoming more and more popular, and I think the communities that we work with are relying more and more heavily on web mapping. I'm not sure it's so much the driver as I think this is our way of getting this information out to communities. Before we had all this information on BioFinder, we were bringing paper maps to communities. So we were really doing some of the same thing, just not in such an organized manner that got it out to as many people. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in, I was in a very tangential way involved in this when it first started up, and a lot of the data layers already existed, but the prioritization data layers that were developed were kind of the new thing, really the trying to take all those different data layers that may or may not have really been related to each other initially and turn them into those prioritization layers was a huge effort that was undergone by a lot of people at A&R. And oh, sorry, I forgot you couldn't see. I don't see any other questions right now. So everybody, this is kind of your last chance. We're probably going to shut things down and say thank you to Monica, unless I see another one come in, but I think that might be it.
Thank you all for attending today.
Thank you, Monica. And as I said, we did record this webinar, and it will be posted up at the VCGI YouTube channel, and I will probably see if I can get Eric to connect to it from the A&R YouTube channel as well. But thank you very much for going through this. This was really interesting. Oh, wait, there's one more question. Is BioFinder server-based? Yeah, right?
Yes, as in all the data is stored on the
data
server,
and the mapping application both. Yep.
And yes, exactly.
Yeah, and it just requires a web browser. It's not, as you mentioned before, it doesn't involve downloading any kind of software.
Right, which for those who have used BioFinder in the past is a change. So most people will be relieved by that change, I think.
And actually, now that there is one more last-minute question, which I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer this, but maybe you can. What is the yearly estimated cost to maintain the tool?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that. If you email me at that contact information I gave you, and I'll show it on the screen again, I know who to direct you to. And so I can answer that question later, but not at the moment. Here we go. Yeah, feel free to send me an email if you do want the answer to that one.
Great. All right. I think that's it for questions. And so thank you very much, Monica. I appreciate you doing this webinar, and I hope that everyone will get in touch if they have additional questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for hosting, Leslie.
No problem. Have a great day, everyone.